Hello, welcome to the concluding roundtable for the 2021 ASEN annual conference on the theme of global perspectives on nationalism and crisis. I'm Jonathan Hearn, president of ASEN, still, even as I was at the beginning of this thing. So this roundtable is very open. We've asked our panelists to speak broadly to the conference theme from a perspective of regional expertise. And obviously we can't cover the whole globe, but we've aimed for a wide distribution. So we've got people talking about Eastern Europe, West Africa, Southeast Asia, and Latin America. This will give us a chance to reflect back on the conference theme through the lens of these various perspectives. I think there are two guiding assumptions here. First, that even global crises look very different from different national or regional perspectives. And second, that different parts of the globe can confront very distinct, more localized or nationalized crises. Both these assumptions warn against simply assuming perspectives prevalent in certain powerful nation states. At the same time, they take seriously the fact that we live in an interconnected world and we need to bring together multiple perspectives in order to develop a more holistic understanding of what we mean by crisis and nationalism. Our contributors will speak for 15 minutes each, and that will be followed by Q&A. You can submit your questions in the usual fashion, the chat on Facebook or YouTube or Zoom, wherever you're viewing this. So as not to keep breaking the flow, I'm going to introduce all four of them briefly right now at the start, and then we will hand over to them. So we have Lenka Buštíková covering Eastern Europe. She's associate professor in the School of Politics and Global Studies at Arizona State University. Her research focuses on party politics, voting behavior, clientelism, and the state and state capacity, with special reference to Eastern Europe. Her book, Extreme Reactions, Radical Right Mobilization in Eastern Europe, is out with Cambridge and demonstrates that far-right parties mobilize against politically ascendant minorities. And she is editor of East European Politics. We also have Judith Byfield on West Africa. She's professor in the Department of History at Cornell. The primary focus of her scholarship has been women's social and economic history in Nigeria, including in-depth studies on tie-dye production, World War II, Nigerian women's political activism and nationalism. And she's currently a Fulbright Global Scholar, beginning a new project called Curry Goat and Gari, West Indian Women in 20th Century Lagosian Society. Dan Slater on Southeast Asia is the Ronald and Eileen Weiser Professor of Emerging Democracies and Director of the Weiser Center for Emerging Democracies at the University of Michigan. He specializes in the politics and history of enduring dictatorships and emerging democracies with a regional focus on Southeast Asia. His book, Ordering Power, Contentious Politics and Authoritative Leviathans in Southeast Asia, is also a Cambridge book and examines how divergent historical patterns of contentious politics have shaped variation in state power and authoritarian durability in 7 Southeast Asian countries. And finally, Miguel Centeno on Latin America. He's the Musgrave Professor of Sociology and Vice Dean of the School of Public and International Affairs at Princeton. He is also founder of the research community on global systemic risk at the Princeton Institute for International and Regional Studies. He's published extensively. His latest books are Global Capitalism with Polity, War and Society, also with Polity, States in the Developing World, a Cambridge book, and the latest of the 3 volumes of State and Nation Making in the Iberian World, also with Cambridge. And he's now working on a book project on the sociology of discipline. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Lenka Buštíková and ask her to speak.
Thank you. I hope everybody can hear me and you can see the screen. I would like to thank the organizers for their very kind invitation. It's a great honor to serve on this panel. And in the time I have allocated, I would like to think about 3 issues that I think might advance the study of nationalities further, or issues that I think emerged in past 5 to 10 years and that deserves more of attention. And obviously, as a scholar of Eastern Europe, I'm looking this at from the Eastern European perspective. So the three issues or avenues for further research I would like to raise are the following. I think this is obviously a conference of the Association for the Study of Nationalities, but I find it more and more puzzling to study cases that do not invoke nationalism or identity. So I think, as much as we want to understand the conditions under which nationalism, identity, ethnicity is invoked, is also important to think about conditions in which we have every expectation to think that identity would be invoked, but the politicians stay away from it. And again, I'm thinking about this from the perspective of someone who studies political mobilization, voting behavior, so on and so forth. So I will sort of briefly touch on the distinction between exclusionary populism and technocratic populism. My second point is a little pitch for my book. I think it's really important to study triggers or conditions under which identity is being set off in politics. It's very important. One mechanism that I think I have identified is policy backlash, sort of changes and the status quo, changes in policies that can be linked to increased far-right mobilization. But I'm sure there are other triggers as well, and I would encourage everybody to think about very specific set of conditions in which identity sets off as a political issue. And number three, I would like to draw our attention to the fact that we see a massive increase, I think both in Europe and the United States, but in Eastern Europe as well, in issues that relate to sexuality, gender, LGBTQ issues. Some people think maybe this is an alternative ethnicity. We see a variety of configurations in which social conservatism or issues of sexuality are being combined with mobilization of ethnicity. And I think these particular configurations should be studied more and probably will have to be studied more in the future. So let me just think about these three puzzles or sort of frontiers or avenues for further research in turn. So nationalism is sometimes not invoked, even though you think this would be a winning card. And I'm coming from this from a perspective of someone who holds a Czech passport. This is a logo of electoral logo of the current Prime Minister of the Czech Republic, Andrej Babiš, who was a very wealthy and successful entrepreneur. And he his basic proposal was to run the state as a firm. He's not doing a very great job. The Czech Republic has one of the highest death rates of COVID right now, and there are some other issues. Therefore, this is crossed over and replaced with debil, which means an idiot. But we, very often, especially scholars in Europe, associate populism with identity politics. But I think sort of studying the Czech case, and then I'll speak briefly about the Slovak case as well, I find absolutely fascinating that in a region that is associated with the rise of identity politics, you do see some politicians not invoking ethnicity at all. So we all know about left-wing populism, inclusionary populism. There is this sort of new emerging literature on technocratic populism, which I define and other people as an output-oriented populism that directly links voters to leaders via expertise. And in this particular configuration, what happens is that voters are so fed up with corruption and bad governance that it leads to the rise of anti-establishment parties, anti-establishment attitudes that gave rise to new parties that run on business expertise or other forms of expertise as well. And sometimes this particular configuration invokes identity or it doesn't. So for example, Slovakia is another case when you see in the recent election a big shift away, or in past few years, you have a country that has been studied from the prism of nationalism. Mature era was an era of nationalism, 1990s era of heightened contestation over ethnicity that slowly withered away. And in the recent election, you really see a rise of issues around corruption. There was a murder of a journalist that, and a politician that, is really skillful in picking up issues that resonate with voters, really shied away of invoking identity. Again, in a country that has been the case where where people sort of associated identity politics with the Slovak politics. That is really weakening. And when I go back to the third issues that relates to sexuality, that might be one way to understand why ethnicity is withering away and being replaced either with technocratic populism or mobilization around issues of sexuality. Second issue I would like to raise is that I think we should really pay attention to triggers or moments or conditions that set off identity-based politics. I try to do this in my book, in which a lot of the book evolves around studying the consequences of language rights or other policies that accommodate minorities. And the book argues that the radical right mobilization or far right mobilization should be understood as a backlash against expansion of rights to ascendant minority groups. And this variation in accommodation can explain why some radical right parties are successful and sometimes they're less successful. And so in this book, I think that I identified a trigger as policy, but again, I think I would encourage the audience or us to think about other triggers that bring identity politics to the forefront. And it also relates to my point at the beginning. I think it's equally, if we understand the triggers, we can understand the conditions under which identity politics, identity is being mobilized, but also conditions under which identities are not being mobilized. So for example, there are a lot of other identities. There are big Chinese communities in Hungary, for example. There is a large, huge Vietnamese community in the Czech Republic, and you never see, or Ukrainian communities in Poland and in other countries, and you do not see mobilization against these groups. That I think has to do with their desire or a lack of desire to acquire more rights. So let's study triggers. That's sort of my call number 2. And the third call is to, I think we will have to do a lot of thinking in the future about the relationship between nationalism and issues of sexuality. So this is, many of you might have seen this. This is a strike of women, kobiet, in Poland after the Polish Constitutional Tribunal ruled that abortions of malformed fetuses are unconstitutional. That this basically it has to become a law, but Poland has a very restrictive 1993 abortion law. And this basically, does not allow any abortions. It was followed by massive mobilization of women, but Poland is playing very hard ball with LGBTQ politics. We see a massive rise of this political dimension in Poland and in other places. We see a lot of mobilization of socially conservative groups. For example, in Poland, the so-called civic circles really contributed significantly to the rise of Viktor Orban in the 2010 elections, because he was able to utilize these groups in his rise to power. And so there are some questions whether the region is shifting from ethnicities to sexuality. Sometimes these two things are a match made on heaven, and you see occasions where in terms of political mobilization, it is it is very easy to mobilize on both dimensions. Sometimes you see that there is a mobilization on ethnicity, for example, in Ukraine, and then just, the LGBTQ very neatly hops in and, everybody proceeds further. But for example, in the Slovak case, you do see that the new, very, very extreme far-right parties mobilize mostly on issues of Catholicism, same-sex marriage, and lesbian rights. They even ditched anti-Semitism. They don't even bother, and they don't bother with mobilization against the Hungarian minority, which has for a long time been the dominant cleavage in politics in Slovakia. So in Eastern Europe and elsewhere, we see big fights over the Istanbul Convention, which is a convention that is a convention against violence against women, including domestic violence. A lot of the countries still need to ratify the convention, and this is becoming basically impossible to do because of lobbying against it. We have seen in many countries constitutional or some referenda failed, but calls for constitutional referenda on same-sex marriage. And of course, going back to the idea of Poland, Poland has cities that declare themselves as LGBTQ zones, and there is also a big mobilization among abortion, which, all of these issues, when you think about identity politics in Eastern Europe, are relatively very new issues. And again, in the future, we will have to think about configurations in which, sexuality and ethnicity are creating sort of a reinforcing vehicle for mobilization, or they can replace each other, or they can lead to further fragmentation of the spectrum when you have some parties that invoke ethnicity more than sexuality. So I thank you for your attention, and I look forward to other presentations.
Thank you, Lenka. I think with that, we'll pass on to Judith.
Okay. Thank you again also for inviting me to participate in this forum today. One of the things that I did, even just to sort of start my brain working through this, was to just take a look at the headlines that you're seeing now on West Africa. And, as usual, there are all these articles that talk about corruption. Of course, a number of articles that are focused on Boko Haram in northern Nigeria, and then even the more generic spate of kidnapping for ransom that is happening across the region. I think in some ways, part of what we are seeing in all of these instances is, in a sense, a lack of imagination, where we can't imagine wealth in the sense of the social well-being of the people of the region. And so these struggles that you are seeing for either access to the state or just economic resources, I think reflect the limited vistas, particularly of the leaders of these countries, of their own social and economic imaginings. And as we know, though, these limitations are not unique to African politicians. They are reflected among those who seek validation through their placement on the Forbes lists of millionaires and billionaires. My thinking through this is informed by theoretical insights that I take from Partha Chatterjee, specifically the idea that nations don't begin or end with the political movements that certainly in the case of West Africa led to the end of colonial rule and the beginning of the post-colonial period. My thinking is also informed by Prajanit Dura's idea that in thinking about the nation, we have to historically locate what he calls the polyphony of voices, contradictory and ambiguous, opposing, affirming, and negotiating their views of the nation rather than succumbing to the harmonized monologic voice of the nation. I'm also informed by Thomas Hodgkins, who wrote about one of the early books about nationalism in Africa, where he encouraged us to pay attention to associations. He argued that associations were democratic in the older sense, in that they had been constructed by a demos, which is slowly discovering by trial and error the institutions which it required in order to live humanely and sociably. Associations were really the outcome of the discontent excited by the philosophy of life. And the nation was the symbol and expression of that philosophy of life. These ideas helped me to think through my own analysis of the women's tax revolt that occurred in Nigeria in 1947, that was led by the Abeokuta Women's Union and its president, Funmilayo Ransom Kuti, who is Fela Kuti's mother. And these ideas shape my remarks today, in part because I see part of what's happening now too is a very contentious debate about the expectations of the nation state, but also the expectations about citizenship. And the claims that we should be able to make on our nations as citizens. Fred Cooper has been particularly helpful in thinking about this through the lens of citizenships. And he says that citizenship certainly informed the claims that were actually being made on imperial powers, just as they're fundamental to the claims now that are being made on post-colonial states. And it actually is one of the things that many scholars of the nationalist era overlooked in our studies. And so in the midst of the numerous crises that envelops the regions today, I sort of take their challenge at heart, that we hear the voices, that polyphonous set of voices, but also pay attention to voices that seem to offer a new philosophy of life. And so my remarks today are going to highlight some of those voices that I think have the potential to be transformative. In the Ivory Coast, for example, scholars are documenting the proliferation of locally initiated Islamic non-governmental organizations, many led by women, especially since the political crisis in 2002 that ultimately led to a civil war. One of the most important activists to come out of this is Aminata Kane Kone, who has been very involved with the Association of Muslim Students of Côte d'Ivoire. Now, this organization goes back to the 1970s, but she became involved in it first in 1989. And 1990s was an era in which women's voices began to take a much more critical position in the organization, where they challenged male Muslims' patriarchal interpretations of Islam. Since then, she has gone on to become a very important public speaker. She joined or was hired by a radio station, Al Bayani, which is a Muslim radio station that actually reaches 95% of the population in Ivory Coast. And it's actually just one of many Islamic radio stations across the region now. She co-hosts a show called Vie des Femmes, Women's Lives, where they address everything from women's rights, education, couple relationships, but also violence against women, economy, unemployment, as well as women's empowerment. And she argues that as a woman of faith, and here I say her arguments very easily resonate with women of other religious practices in the region, but she insists that as a woman of faith, that in fact does not prevent her and should not prevent her from being financially independent, from taking advantage of professional opportunities, and in fact from addressing things like the gender pay gap that exists. And so she's promoting a reevaluation of gender and citizenship, as well as a reevaluation of the idea that women can in fact play a range of roles within these societies, while at the same time meeting their obligations and expectations of motherhood. And in her case, motherhood, she's a mother of 8, actually. You're also seeing reevaluations of citizenship from other constituencies and caregivers, in fact, have become an important group that through their work and sort of advocacy that has come out of the medical crises of the last few years, they have been, in fact, insisting that the state live up to its obligations to provide health care for its citizens. And so you began to see a lot of research around this, particularly in the wake of the AIDS pandemic, but also specifically Ebola in the case of Liberia. And studies done among care workers there show that they are involved in, that they do see their work as in part a response to their sense of obligation to the nation, that they see, have a deep sense of communal obligations and see their work as fostering reciprocity with other community members. But they have also pushed back on the sort of praise that they have gotten from their selfless work by saying, but this is not enough. And in fact, we should be part of those agencies that, are engaged with the government, that are in fact agencies that are talking about the dissemination of resources to them as workers, healthcare workers, but also more broadly, in terms of the healthcare system. They have also been an important voice among international donors. And so challenging international donors that it's not enough and certainly not appropriate that we only see them during these moments of crises, where at the same time, they have actually contributed to the decimation of national healthcare systems in the country. Jonathan, I'll have to ask you to let me just signal to me time because I forgot to turn my timer on. Okay. The other, I think, important voice or set of voices that we should be paying attention to are those who consider themselves Afropolitan, or at least those who are part of that transnational community. The term Afropolitan actually sort of came into play in 2005, and it was coined by Taye Selassie, who wrote this groundbreaking article where she called for a recognition of a new generation of African global subjects. These are the people who were navigating through this cross-cultural transnation experience. And the term Afropolitan actually caught on very quickly. It was often presented as something very positive. They were creative, innovative. Many of them were artistic, and they were in, sort of the capitals of capital in a sense. They regarded themselves as part of an elevated new African consciousness that rejected prevailing associations with Africa as only a site of crisis, be it political turmoil or disease. While the concept became associated with images of chauffeur-driven men and women in suits and corporate offices, criticism followed fast and furiously. And specifically, many people called attention to, in fact, the class position of these individuals, but also the celebration of consumer capitalism. And one critic, Emma Daribi, wrote, while Afropolitanism may go some way in addressing the balance concerning Africans speaking for themselves, the problem lies in the fact that we still do not hear narratives of Africans who were not privileged. The emergence of a transnational African elite is very much part of the history of neoliberalism in Africa and the political and economic crises that encouraged migration to the West. But the emergence of this group, in fact, is quite complex because among them or those who are also forging transnational political and cultural networks that are offering new definitions of global citizenship. Take, for example, the work of Kudoso Onikeku, who is engaged in what he calls, quote, a techno-futurist social experiment, unquote, where in fact he's been very involved in renovating Glover Hall, a historical and cultural site of Lagos, into, quote, an example of a modern heritage living museum, unquote. Glover Hall was actually built in 1887 in honor of the British governor, John Howley Glover, rather, who was governor between 1864 and 1872. And it's been the site of major political and cultural moments in Nigerian history. So, for example, it was where Herbert Macaulay, who's the father of Nigerian nationalism, launched his political party, the NNDP. It was where workers marched in 1945, or marched to in 1945 to launch a general strike, and where the film of Wole Soyinka's Kongi's Harvest had its major screening. Onikeku, sorry, yes?
Just to say maybe a couple more minutes, is that about?
Couple more, okay, thanks. Yes, he's a dancer, and he describes himself as a movement artist and community organizer. He actually trained in France, and he has been able to work with the governor to help encourage the development of creative centers. Glover Hall was renovated in 2018 and became home of the Q Dance Center, which is now the People's Center. And it's become a major space for young people and sort of creating this global network backed by the international rise of Afrobeat music, which actually was the music that was associated with Fela Kuti. And so what we're seeing, I think, in this moment is a period of multiple interlocking crises that require action on multiple levels simultaneously: local communities, governments, national governments, and the international communities. But hopefully, when we write the history of this period, it won't focus only on the spectacular failures. It will also engage the many voices that try to offer a different way of thinking and living. In short, a new philosophy of life. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Judith. With that, I think we will pass over to Dan Slater.
Okay, well, thanks very much for the introduction earlier, Jonathan, and for the invitation to be speaking with you all today. So when I was first invited to give a presentation on the theme of nationalism and crisis in our region of interest, I wouldn't have anticipated at that point that I would be speaking about only one country and just speaking about Myanmar. But at the moment, I find it sort of impossible to talk about crisis in Southeast Asia without putting Myanmar front and center. And so, I'll be making reference to some things that I've talked about in my existing research, as well as some new ideas I wanted to put on the table for our discussions today. But and certainly in Q&A, I'm more than happy to talk about the region more generally. But I think Myanmar is quite illustrative of some important points. So for those of you who've been following the news, Myanmar, we're sort of on the cusp at best, or already in the teeth, more likely, of what's really shaping up to be a complete cataclysm in Myanmar at this point. What we've seen since the February 1st coup is we've got a brutal military, which essentially has zero internal legitimacy, which threw out the free and fair elections that took place in November, and it is completely thrown aside, ditched the power sharing arrangements that it had in place with civilian leaders, which they've had in place for the last 5 to 10 years. And now it would appear that this is a military that is hell-bent on using whatever repression it needs to use to be able to stay in power and to stay in power on its own. And in large measure to exclude the only widely unifying figure in the nation, namely Aung San Suu Kyi, to exclude her from any kind of role in political life. in public life. So there's really no clear resolution to this. This only seems to be getting worse and worse. And so part of what motivates me today is to be thinking a bit about other historical parallels and how we might think about this moment of crisis. So if we could think of Syria at the moment as having been kind of the world's sort of defining cataclysm of the 2010s, I think Myanmar is well on its way and shaping up to become, to play that unfortunate role in the 2020s. So that's what's in the news. But then for our purposes today, so what does nationalism have to do with all of this? In a word, I'd like to say everything. But more specifically, I'd like to make 2 points in my brief remarks today. One, as I mentioned, is draws on research that I've been working on for some time on nationalism and democratization across South and Southeast Asia. And this is collaborative work with Maya Tudor from Oxford University. But also I want to put some new ideas into the conversation. So not, I wouldn't say they're not exactly research ready, but possibly food for thought. So the first point I'd like to make is that there is an intrinsic connection, I would argue, between types of nationalism and political regime types. And the second point that I'd like to make is that I think there is an urgent need, which Myanmar reveals to us, an urgent need to rethink some types of authoritarianism in the world today as what I'm going to call internal imperialism. Now, I'm sure everyone's familiar with Michael Hector's work and his concept of internal colonialism and his notion that the rise of the modern nation state has resembled a form of internal colonialism. But Hector's point is that this is sort of routine. This is the norm, that the nation states we see were built through internal colonialism. But what I want to suggest is something far rarer, far more extreme, in which the governing authorities within a given nation state, even though they come from that nation state, are so bereft, are so devoid of any kind of internal support and legitimacy that they take on sort of the flavor of alien rule. And I want us to sort of struggle a bit with this. How do we think about contexts where you have not literally an alien ruler, but a local ruler who has come to take on the visage, if you will, of alien rule? And how do we think about this? So internal imperialism. So what's unfolding in Myanmar today, I would argue, is really becoming more like a war of independence than anything else, and more like the kind of color revolutions and protests for regime change that we see happening around the world. And it's, so when we think about parallels, I want us to think about French Algeria, think about occupied Palestine, and also think historically about British Burma itself, what Burma was like under alien British rule. But we have to think anew about what British Burma was like and the kind of nationalism that emerged out of British rule. Because what I would argue is happening right now in Myanmar is it's not only a battle to liberate the nation from military rule, it's also a battle to redefine the nation, and to redefine the nation in a new, more pluralistic, more multi-ethnic way than what has dominated in Burma, Myanmar, since independence in the late 1940s. So the first point that I wanted to make, right? So this idea that regime types and types of nationalism have an intrinsic connection. So across Southern Asia, Maya Tudor and I argue that wherever the nation was defined in more inclusive and more egalitarian ways, that it becomes a lasting resource for democracy and for actors who want to create a more sort of democratic political arrangement. And by inclusive and egalitarian, what I mean, there's really two dimensions here, is to what extent the nation is defined as inclusive in terms of ethnicity and religion, but also in terms of popular versus elite sort of defining character of the nation. So nations can be defined from their birth as more or less elitist, more or less ethnic, religious, as opposed to civic or more popular. So by inclusive or egalitarian nationalism, really we're talking about more civic and more popular forms of nationalism. And by contrast, it's not just that when you lack these kinds of nationalism that you don't have a democratic resource. It's also the case that where the nation is defined in more exclusive ways, in more hierarchical ways, that this is sort of a lasting resource for authoritarian forces. that those who wish to rule in more authoritarian fashion are able to use these definitions of the nation in their favor. So using elitism, so a kind of nationalism which basically doesn't portray ordinary people as major actors in the forging of the nation, but instead points to elite figures, or who basically portrays one kind of religious group, one kind of ethnic group, one regional group, one linguistic group as being second-class citizens. Okay, so on these grounds, Myanmar's historical inheritance is mostly quite unfortunate. It is an extremely ethnicized form of nationalism that has dominated for the past 70 plus years. And it is mostly an elitist form of nationalism as well. So to the ethnic point, I need point no further than the Rohingya crisis, the genocidal violence that took place against the Muslim minority Rohingya in northern Rakhine state in Myanmar. And it's not just the violence that took place at the hands of the military, but the fact that this was essentially a popular mass killing campaign. That the way the nation has been defined in Burma is such that the Rohingya are not considered citizens. They're not considered part of the nation. And they were an utterly friendless group, not only a minority, but an utterly friendless group as they were brutally attacked. So this, I think, just is sort of one piece of evidence to show you the way that ethnicity has been front and center. The idea that Burma, as it was originally called, is a country for Burman Buddhists, first and foremost. And then to the question of elitism, I think that the kind of irreplaceable role that Aung San Suu Kyi plays in Myanmar also, I think, bespeaks the elitism problem that we see in Myanmar as well. So if you aren't aware, Aung San Suu Kyi is the daughter of Aung San, who's sort of the unparalleled nationalist icon and nationalist hero. So the fact that there's kind of no alternative to her in a way, also, I think, says something about the weakness of popular nationalism in Myanmar as well. Although I hasten to add that students have played historically leading roles in popular resistance. And so I don't want to suggest that there's not a kind of a popular nationalist energy in Myanmar as well, but it is sort of struggling now to break free and to assert itself, I would say. So what's really been striking since the February 1st coup is not simply the strength of popular protest. This, anyone who studies Myanmar's history would know this is what happens when the military tries to seize power on its own. This is what happened, under colonial rule as well. So it's not so much the strength of protest itself, but the fact that urban protesters in the ethnic core of Myanmar are aligned so openly are coalescing so openly with ethnic minorities and with these ethnic armed associations that have long been in conflict with the military. And so the rallying cry of the protest has been federal democracy. And when you say federal democracy in Myanmar, you inevitably mean multi-ethnic democracy. And so the fact that there's this cry for a kind of multi-ethnic nationalism, this really would, if successful, it would constitute nothing less than a redefinition of the nation in Myanmar, even a rebirth of the nation in Myanmar. So this is kind of what is at stake. And when we look at the civil disobedience movement, what we should be thinking about. But on the other hand, and this moves me more toward the second point, the resistance this movement is facing is both implacable and actually quite extraordinary. So history has seen lots of military regimes. The vast majority of them have at least some plausible legitimacy claim, and they have at least some level of public support. So if you think about, military rule as it currently exists in Egypt, or in Thailand. These were military regimes that came about in response to polarization. One side of the political system sees them as essential protectors against another kind of citizen. This is not the case in Myanmar at all. Myanmar has none of this kind of internal legitimacy from causing political order or protection from internal enemies that society perceives. It is basically ruled since 1962, I would argue, as internal imperialists. And this, to my mind, raises a set of questions. Is it possible, and can we think of other examples where a national actor can impose the equivalent of alien rule on a population? Here in America, I think that it often struck me during the Trump years that I felt like it was a bit like living through the Vichy regime or something like that. There was this sense that it was almost as like being occupied by outsiders, right? That DC had been occupied by people with a totally different view of the nation than I held. And that's, not nearly as serious an example as what's going on in Myanmar right now, but I think it raises this point of, at what point does a government kind of lose the claim to sovereignty, despite being constituted by fellow nationals due to its lack of internal legitimacy? Okay, so at what point does a democracy movement become something better compared to an anti-imperial movement than a standard democracy movement? At what point does an authoritarian regime, become as unacceptable, as illegitimate, as undeserving of sovereignty as a case like French Algeria? Because we have to realize that negotiations, power sharing, that for protesters in Myanmar today, these are utterly unacceptable. It's simply not acceptable at this point to sort of sit down and say, well, how are we going to negotiate a peaceful resolution to this crisis? How are we going to reassemble some kind of power sharing arrangement between military and civilians? The military has been utterly and completely discredited, even beyond as discredited as has been historically by these recent events. And so I can't help but think that the kind of uncompromising claims of these protesters echo older cases. And so it leaves me wondering, how did we think about the justifiability of violent resistance in anti-colonial wars? Because I can't imagine that when there was resistance to French and Algeria, that people sort of said, well, ultimately this is something that I'm sure some people were calling for negotiated settlements, but ultimately the idea in these anti-imperial cases, I think, had to have been that there was an unacceptability, a deeper form of illegitimacy to these ruling arrangements that I think is kind of echoed in this case of Myanmar today. And so these are things that I think of as kind of as urgent questions today when we consider the case of Myanmar, perhaps when we consider other dictatorships around the world. At what point the fact that they have formal sort of de jure national status doesn't in fact translate into a kind of de facto national status as any kind of rightful sovereign government over a particular territory and a particular people. So I will stop there and turn things over. Thank you.
Thank you, Dan. With that, I think we pass on to Miguel Centeno.
Okay, let me just share my screen. Oh gosh, no. Just a minute. I have to first call this up, and I've only been doing this for 6 months, and you'd think I would be able to do it by now. But
We're starting to see it, I think.
Can you see now? You should see a screen.
Yeah, we see the whole screenshot.
Yeah, okay, all right. Let me just do the slideshow. Okay, so thank you again. Like everybody said, thank you so much, Jonathan, for organizing this and for the invitation. It's been fascinating to hear what's been said so far. I'm afraid I kind of took the topic pretty literally, and I thought that we were going to be talking more about the state of crisis today and the state of nationalism in this region. So my comments are much more limited in some ways than what we've just heard from everybody else, and my apologies for that. So I took the question to be, is there a link between crisis and nationalism? And the obvious crisis these days is COVID-19, the reason why we're all looking at each other through these TV screens. And let me just give you, there's more, I'm sure there's a definition of nationalism. There's more than one definition of nationalism per piece written about nationalism. I'm just going to talk about it as the allegiance and an emotional link to a nation state, to a set of symbols, to a set of values, etc. So the first point I have to make is that Latin America is a very strange place in the sense that it's very low on what I call nationalist fervor. It might be high on a patriotic sort of fervor. Mis montañas son las mejores montañas. My mountains are the best mountains, or my music is the best, or blah, 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 blah. But in terms of really believing, taking the state seriously, Argentinians, for example, you will find, fights between Boca and River, you will find very few bar fights about La Nación Argentina and the Gobierno Argentino. There's very little of that sort of faith in these set of national institutions. The one exception is during the Copas, when all of a sudden everybody buys a flag of their particular country. But certainly coming from the United States, it's always remarkable how few flags you tend to see in Latin America. You certainly don't see the sort of flag fetish that you see in the United States as much. And there's widespread distrust of the state. I love the concept of Azibaya, that sense of, even Khaldun, of community, of wholeness. And I think that's one of the things that's characterized Latin American political economy from the very beginning, this lack of particularistic nationalism. So with those definitions, so I'm going to be dealing with COVID, and I'm going to be dealing with, in a sense, a place that has little of this classic sense of nationalism. And the two questions I wanted to ask was, does nationalism help response to COVID? So does this fervor, does this faith in the nation state help in their response to COVID? And does COVID bid nationalism? And it's interesting that in Latin America, you do see these moments when these crises, these moments do bring out nationalism. One of the most striking one was 10 years ago, I guess it was, the famous 33 miners in Chile. And Chile has always been something of an exception in Latin America in the sense of its sense of nationalism, because the site of the miners and all over the country, there were Chilean flags everywhere. You would very rarely see, I was trying to imagine a mining accident in Argentina that would have lots of Argentine flags, or a mining accident in Mexico that would do that. So these moments of crisis do tend to build sort of nationalism. 9/11 in 2001 is another obvious example. The still symbolic power of the Pacific War in both Bolivia and in Peru, and of course in Chile as well. The Cuban embargo, which has probably done more for the regime since 1959 than any other policy, because it has fostered this kind of nationalism. So let's look at the relationship between a society living through a crisis and sort of nationalist fervor. And one of the things that's very frustrating about COVID is finding any kind of pattern. I mean, this is one of 10 million possible XY graphs that you can have. Down here is the GDP per capita, and here's confirmed COVID deaths per capita. The only finding that you can find here is that COVID is almost a rich country's disease. And that's partly because I believe we're going to find out over the next couple of years that one of the biggest explainers for COVID rate was your centrality in the global web. And so what we have here, for example, is a part of the world that is not as well integrated into the global web, certainly in terms of international travel, et cetera. And again, everybody, in a sort of, and I hope, Judith, I don't know if you agree with me, in a sort of very patronizing way, everybody keeps saying, why is sub-Saharan Africa not aflame with COVID? As if, well, you would expect them to have this problem. We Europeans are having this problem. How come the Ivory Coast doesn't have this problem? For whatever reason, that's one pattern you find. And then you find that the worst cases are among the wealthy. Latin America really there's no pattern other than we're dying way above our income league. The Latin America has death rates, in a sense, far above what you would expect given its GDP per capita, but there is no clear pattern here, and certainly none that you could map out to any sort of sense of nationalism. Let me just go one more. I think the response to COVID in Latin America can be explained largely three things: bureaucratic capacity, simply having the emergency infrastructure, the health infrastructure, testing, fatality, inoculation. It's no accident that probably the country that has suffered the least in some ways is Uruguay. And it's also the country with the most legitimate, probably whose government or whose state enjoys the most support. and that there is a fairly good health infrastructure. It turns out that Chilean exceptionalism in terms of state capacity was severely limited in the health sector because the public health sector is pretty bad, but of course the private health sector is quite good. Another factor that helps explain the response to COVID is political leadership. And we have no better example than Senor Bolsonaro in Brazil, and Almo in Mexico, where it has not been the failure of the population to deal with the crisis or a failure of the state to deal with the crisis. It has been a political decision. And again, the United States in 2019 being the other obvious example. And then there is a social support resistance that might explain COVID. And here, inequality. I mean, the best case for this is in Chile, where your likelihood of A, contracting COVID, and B, surviving COVID are very highly correlated with your class position. And that's going to be true throughout the region. And I'm sure we're going to come up with a whole new measure of inequality. The response to COVID is going to produce a whole new other measure of inequality in the region. Just what we needed is another sign of that. So I don't think nationalism has anything to do with the COVID response. I just don't see a link between the two. What I have seen is the causal relationship going the other way. COVID promoting a great deal of nationalism. We saw the most obvious case in the case of the Kung Fu flu and the China virus and all of that in the United States, which has led to the tragedy of the last few months of violence against Asian Americans. It tends to promote a sense of exclusion. This is, it's often said that a crisis can bring people together. Well, crises both lead to inclusion in some ways, but also lead to exclusion. And we've seen a lot of this, a lot of anti-immigrant rhetoric, not just in the United States, but for example, and Lenka, correct me if I'm wrong, a lot of anti-immigrant rhetoric in Eastern Europe associated with fears of COVID, the unclean are coming, blah, 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 blah. The one positive is in the few cases that have gone well, I'm sure it's promoted a sense of pride. Dan, I don't know how much you work on Vietnam, but I mean, there must be a huge Vietnamophilic moment because Vietnam has done so well. I've heard the same thing from folks who go to Taiwan, that this has become a sense of pride, the way of being able to deal with it. But what COVID has done is what every crisis seems to do. It defines the in and the out groups much more starkly. If you happen to be in the in group, that means you're having a great moment of we are us. If you're in the out group, then it's a moment of you are not us. And I think COVID has certainly done that. In terms of the possible relationships between what we might call again nationalism and COVID, Chile, well, they just blew the last. They were doing very well with immunization, and then they're not doing so well now. I think the most interesting case, the reaction is going to be, believe it or not, Cuba, and that's not just because I'm Cuban and I have a Cuban-centric notion of the universe. But if Soberana, which is a wonderful name for a Cuban vaccine, sovereignty, if that really takes off, the fact that Cuba could really, Cuba could produce a vaccine, it might give the regime another 20, 25 years of legitimacy, because it would be an incredible accomplishment for Cuba with a health sector, a minuscule size of the one of the United States, being able to come up with what apparently so far seems to be very good. It's having disastrous consequences in other places, in Mexico, in Peru, but more than anywhere else in Brazil. And I will leave with the thought that for a state that was already sort of thrown off by all the corruption, I mean, Petrobras had been this moment had this been the symbol of pride for many Brazilians, and to find out that it was just as corrupt as your local policeman did a lot. And then this latest effort, the crisis that is occurring in Brazil, I believe yesterday or the day before, is 5,000 deaths a day. Now, if you take that over a year, that's 1.5 million people that might end up dying in Brazil. And so far, the state has done absolutely nothing. And over and above the tragedy of hundreds of thousands, and hopefully not millions of deaths in Brazil, is the damage that this response has done to the Brazilian sense of nationalism and pride in the state. And my last thought is, you know, nationalism is a little bit like a Ponzi scheme. It only works as long as everybody believes it. And the minute anybody starts challenging and starts asking who the man is behind the curtain, it can fall apart very, very, very quickly. And I think one of the horrible effects is going to be even further to legitimize a state in a region where the legitimacy of the state was already fairly in question, and nationalism. So overall, what's happened with this particular crisis in nationalism in Latin America has been way, way too many deaths, but relatively few flags being raised or any sense of I don't know, community feeling, etc. And with that, thank you very much.
I'm going to slide things around on my screen here. Thanks, Miguel. Well, that was fascinating. Very, as we kind of expected, quite a diverse set of responses to the question. We're going to move into Q&A. I have, okay, questions are starting to come in. There was a kind of dialogue going on between the panelists and various people previous, but I don't think those count as questions. So I will start with and towards the end I may kind of ask some wrapping up questions, but start with a question that's directed to Dan Slater from Athena Luisi. She says, however much a military dictator seems alien in ideology or values to the people over whom they rule, it seems to me that the concept of internal colonialism can only be applied metaphorically in Myanmar, except for the experience of the Rohingya, and an analytic distinction should be maintained between type of government, democracy, dictatorship, etc., and the ethnic and national identity between ruler and ruled. So I think that's much a proposal as a question, but Dan?
Okay. Do we want to collect some, or do you want me to just go ahead and
why don't you go ahead? We're still rolling in here.
Well, I certainly, thanks for the question. I certainly agree that these questions of ethnicity and form of nationalism and regime type should be treated as distinct, because that what we argue is that there's a causal connection. If they were the same thing, it wouldn't be a causal connection at all. So the idea is that the way that the nation is defined in these early stages can have these lasting, probabilistic, effects, encouraging resource effects toward different types of regimes. And so I certainly agree with that. When I say internal imperialism, the idea is very much not to try to echo too much the Hector idea. So Hector's idea is very much one of that there's and if it were internal colonialism, what we would be thinking about, and it doesn't fit the Rohingya either, in my opinion, and I'll tell you why. So internal colonialism, the idea is sort of that you as the nation, the national core, kind of asserts authority over an entirety of a population and shows a real interest in governing an entire territory, but doing so kind of in the name of and on the side of the central ethnic group. What the military in Burma has done for over half a century is basically kind of scorched earth sort of tactics and across the country, and has shown really no interest in governing, and no interest in trying to turning peasants into Frenchmen or however we might want to think about this. It just simply is not what has been going on. the notion, I think Mary Callahan, the best, political historian of the Burmese military, has really, I think, convincingly shown that this is a military that sees the population within its territory as enemies. And in that respect, there is a kind of like literal alienation, which I think we could think of on some kind of scale of, to what degree a regime in power, and particularly an organized one. So not just like a personalist dictator. I mean, I was thinking as Professor Byfield was speaking, I was thinking about when Sani Abacha was in power in Nigeria. There was a sense in which absolutely, this was someone who had access to oil revenue, and that's the only reason he was in power. It was just an incredibly unpopular leader. But this is this is of a different magnitude in the sense, this is the military organization. And its levels of, and the kind of alienation that it experiences from its own population is extraordinary. And I simply can't get analytical leverage on it by comparing it to other authoritarian regimes or other military regimes in the world. It's just quite different in that respect. And so I'm sort of grasping at ways to make some kind of analytical sense of it.
Thank you, Dan. Judith, you have your hand up. Did you want to come in?
Yes, yeah, just follow up on what Dan had said, in the sense that you can have military regimes that are popular. And you're absolutely right. Sani Abacha was extremely unpopular. One of the leaders before him, Babangida, when he came into office, in fact, he was very popular at the time because he succeeded the current president when he was head of the Supreme Military Council, Buhari, where there were some very unpopular decisions made under Buhari as well. And so I think I hear what you're trying to say in terms of thinking about the nature of the way the military is ruling there at this moment, because it does put them on a spectrum where, in fact, they seem to not have any investment in any sort of buy-in from the society at all.
Thank you, Judith. So we've got a few questions that go to Miguel, so I'll cover them all, and he can respond as he sees fit. So the first one from Matvey Lomonosov is there some indication of Russian vaccine involvement in Cuba? Have not heard about the Cuban case in Russia in the Russian media. Usually they boast every success of friendly nations in vaccine geopolitics. Second question from Graham. If Bolsonaro goes, will it provide an opportunity to move from lava jato, COVID, and so on, or is Brazil going to be dealing with it for the long term? And finally, a question from James Gao. Great comparative structure. Are you able to extemporize comparisons with New Jersey and its environment and other parts of the world? And what significance, if any, could you draw from the absence of flags for future political developments?
Okay, let's see. The first on the Russian influence. I mean, I'm not a chemist. For all I know, Soberana is Sputnik under a different name. Whether this is a great PR machine, I don't think Vladimir Putin is known for his subtlety. So I don't think he would give the Cubans this kind of legitimacy by letting them call Sputnik Soberana, and I don't think that's worth. Why the Russians have not played this up? Just from my time, I lived for a while in post-Soviet Russia, and from what I remember, the memories of the Cuban adventure, where you guys cost us a lot of money. So I don't know if there's a lot of popular support for Cuba right now, where you would get this kind of reaction. If Bolsonaro goes, yeah. Let's see how he goes. I mean, when the three military chiefs resign at the same time in a place like Brazil, my little neck hairs go up a bit. Let's see how he leaves. It looks right now that if it all followed, Lula would come back. I don't know how people might feel about that. I think the last 10 years have been so traumatic for Brazilians. There was the famous Rio Cristo, shooting off like a rocket. And then the Economist a couple of years later had it being a rocket that was going around and going back to Earth. I think there was this moment of pride, of faith that finally Brazil was going to be the country of the future. And the last 10 years have just been, and then there's the famous World Cup. It's been such a disaster that I don't know what the Brazilian state can do to gather confidence in itself again. As to New Jersey, that's an interesting question. New Jersey, there's very little nationalism in New Jersey. New Jersey hates itself. Somebody said that nationalism is a nation worshiping itself. Jersey doesn't really like itself, so I don't know about that. It's interesting. What's interesting to me in Jersey is, as again, throughout the United States, perhaps throughout the world, how stratified the effect of COVID has been. I live in an upper middle class bubble here in Princeton, and everybody wear masks and everybody's very nice. And of course, we don't have a problem. 10 miles away is Trenton, which is suffering a collapse of some of the health infrastructure. What really is remarkable to me is that nobody says this. It's not talked about. I mean, there's been some talk about how much the African American and Latino community has suffered much more under COVID because of lots of demographic and economic reasons. But here it is. It's right in front of us, and yet that's not eliciting any kind of comment, which is, I don't know. It's a comment about either New Jersey or the United States or politics. I'm not quite sure what.
Thanks, Miguel. Okay, I'm sort of chopping and changing between various channels of questions here, but a question for Lenka, and this is from Daphne Halakipolu. Is the pattern in Eastern Europe really about authoritarianism rather than nationalism? I think she's picking up on this thing you were raising about ethnic identity not seeming to always be the point.
Yeah, so in my view, the only, certified autocratic country in Eastern Europe as a member of the European Union is Hungary. And then, we can speak about, cases outside. I think Poland, I think there is hope for Poland. And, I would like to mention that, when we think about democratic backsliding in Eastern Europe or the emergence of the democracies, actually a lot of the initial thought about the durability of democratic consolidation was linked to this, broad-based nationalism as a facilitating factor, sort of a more, uniform nationalism. So that thinking has certainly changed, because you see that the countries, some people are thinking that ethnic homogeneity actually helps with democratic backsliding. There's some research that's showing that political fragmentation that can be linked to ethnic fragmentation prevents sort of the dominant parties from creating supermajorities in parliaments, and they cannot change the constitution, they cannot change the electoral systems, they cannot really bully over the court. So there is some, counterintuitive scholarship, I think, emerging that says ethnic heterogeneity, if it's translated into some blocking votes in the parliament, can be good, because these countries will not backslide as quick as possible. And I think, nationalism is playing out differently, even in cases in Estonia or in other cases that we have always studied through the prism of nationalism as the main or the second main cleavage of party competition. You see that a lot of the issues of sexuality are being injected as well. So, the Estonian party now has a platform about gays and lesbians. And, some of it is internal, some of it is being sponsored from abroad, from conservative circles from the United States or from Russia. So that, there's a lot of money are pouring in to support socially conservative movements. And if there is a civic activism on the rise in Eastern Europe, it's on the right. It's not the progressive movement. There is some counter mobilization, but you know, in terms of mobilization, you observe it really. You observe it really on the right side of the spectrum. A lot of it goes through churches and socially conservative groups that sort of enable this mobilization. So I think, so again, that's why I'm sort of suggesting that I think we really have to, because it's sort of screaming into everybody's face so loudly, we have to rethink the relationship between sexuality and nationalism. One last footnote I want to add: Eastern Europe is the fastest demographically declining region in the Europe, in the world actually. The fertility rates are low. There is a lot of out migration. There are massive labor shortages. Again, depends country by country, but there is a massive, and this also affects healthcare sectors because the out migration is very often to the West, you know, nurses care for the elderly. So this is also, and so the idea there is that if you have these labor shortages, how do you keep the population going? So the answer to that is not migration. I mean, that sort of goes back to the idea is to replace it with your own people, with your own women giving babies. So I think that's another factor that's playing into this, you know, rise of sexuality as a political issue.
Miguel, did you want to respond to that?
Yeah, I just think this is fantastic, Lenka. I've not heard it from many people. This association of nationalism with what we might call a toxic masculinity, and I think you almost can't understand nationalism without this gender element. Certainly, my anecdotal exposure to this stuff, whether in the United States or outside, thank you for that, because I think without understanding that gender element, you don't quite get the full scope of anger that's behind a lot of this stuff.
And anxiety, yeah.
Yeah, anxiety, status anxiety, yes.
Okay, thank you. And we have a question here for Dan from Andreas Kandi. Thinking about internal imperialism, can we really think about it without asking the other question, that of extraction, and without situating the military in the larger structure of global capital?
Okay, good question. Actually, I think you can. Not that you to think about it that way, but in the following sense. So 10 years ago, when the military in Burma embarked on this, you know, wrote this new constitution, embarked on this power sharing arrangement with civilians, basically it's been what the French would call cohabitation, essentially, with the military running one part of the state, the civilians another. I mean, one of the major reasons to do so was because, you know, Myanmar had been so left out. It had been such kind of a hermit kingdom, if you will, and wanting to tap into global capital, global investment, and basically join the Asian boom. So 10 years ago, I think you could have made this argument and said there's something about global capital and the like, and you know, Myanmar, in Wallerstein's terms, Myanmar wants to be a periphery of the world economy rather than being external to the global economy, right? Well, but what we're seeing now is this in no way, this is not doing the bidding of global capital. I mean, no one outside is happy about this. It's going to make it hard. It's civil war. It's going to be harder to do investment. Everyone's investments are in danger. You know, companies are going to be pulling out. There's going to be boycotts against military-linked companies. Everything about this goes against the idea that politics is driven by, driven by some kind of doing the bidding of external capital or external empire. So that's just one. It's a great question, but it's yet one more way in which what we're seeing is it's just such an incredibly irrational, from any any perspective we could think of, move that the military has made over these last 2.5 months, and they seem to be ready to just stick with it, despite the costs.
Thanks, Dan. I'm going to try a question now that's from Noah, and it seems to be directed to everyone. So jump in, whoever wants to. The question is: does the relative increase in China's power and relative decrease in the US's power affect how different regions will react to crises, current and future? Real big picture question there. Anybody wants to dive in?
I can start off with that simply because the United States has somewhat dominated Latin America. It's going to be very interesting for Latin America to, if we lose the specter of the United States or the CIA, et cetera, it's such a huge part of the Latin American political narrative, even today, that it's gonna, if the United States continues to sort of separate itself from the rest of the world, it's gonna throw off the political discourse of a large part of Latin America, because the big ogre is not around anymore. From what I understand, there's been relatively very little xenophobic behavior in Latin America. So the rise of China, it's there. People are aware of it. It's now become, I believe, in almost all cases, it's become the #2 trade partner. But you don't see, from what I've seen, again, this is the kind of thing that you look for your keys under the lamppost because that's where you will see them. I don't know. For all I know, but I have not seen a rise. I have not seen China beginning to replace the United States as the imperial threat. I have not seen any sign of that.
Does anybody else want to weigh in on this question?
Yeah, if just very briefly, I think the only answer, obvious answer, is vaccine diplomacy. So, for example, the Czech president, who is, in a way, Chinese agent, I would even say, to some degree, just forced the prime minister to sack a health minister in the middle of a horrible pandemic because of his obstructionist view of the Chinese and Russian vaccines. So, as you know, in the European Union, everybody's waiting for AstraZeneca and Pfizer, and Serbia, but Hungary, actually the Slovak prime minister actually was forced to resign also because of big contentious issues over Sputnik. But China is really filling this vacuum very aggressively. And I think if the United States, doesn't wake up and really doesn't think of a way to, supply vaccines to some parts of the world, they will lose this war. And it's very serious.
Thank you. Judith?
Yeah, I was going to say that in Africa, the tremendous amount of Chinese investments in agriculture, also in terms of construction. There are plans on the books now where China is going to basically create a modern railway system in Nigeria. And so while some people are calling attention to this and suggesting that there are potential negative outcomes, one having to do with then the debt that African states will now owe to China in the future. Also, people call attention to the fact that the Chinese government really stays out of debates around human rights and political, the African states and how they deal with their populations. And so even though there was a lot of ambivalence sometimes with how the US talked about human rights abuses, the fact that you still had spaces within the US that brought those issues to the fore, that was important. But China has been more than willing to cooperate with some very despicable African leaders. But I think there's just, it's still very unclear how this is going to unfold, because there's some people who are suggesting that China is, in a sense, taking the role of the 19th century imperialists, so old wine, new bottle.
Thank you. Dan, you seem to be content with these answers, so I'll keep it moving. There's a question that's come in to Judith, so maybe I'll just send that to her since she's been talking. The question is from Athena Luisi. Is Afropolitanism global or African-centered? In what way is it a philosophy of life which is distinctly African?
It's It's global in the sense that it reflects a community of people who move easily around the globe. Many of them, are based in New York or in London and move back and forth between these capitals and the different African countries that they belong to. I think it's creating a new conversation around, or contributing to a new conversation around Pan-Africanism and sort of a global African identity. At the same time that you have this part of the discourse is about this sort of, just African culture. They are also, Ghanaian American or Nigerian American. So there's still a part of that identity that's very much invested in the nation state. But I think, I think it's going to be, as these conversations about class continue to swirl in the discussion about Afropolitanism, I think it's going to generate new thinking about, well, where does an Afropolitan, in a sense, fit into a global sense of citizenship? Are they going to be the person, or are they going to, some of them remain a part of that group that just continues to celebrate consumer capitalism, or are they going to be a part of that sort of global discourse around socialism or around environmental health? So I think there are a lot of different conversations that are going to connect to this group.
Thank you, Judith. We're coming towards the end of our run. I will throw in one more question. I see that Miguel has responded to the Torah in the chat, so I'll just leave that there. But to the whole group, from Alice, does crisis offer opportunities for improving the position of women in the world, or make it more likely that the oppression of women will worsen, or both at the same time? I think this brings together Lenka's issues about sex and just the global nature of the problem in a nice way. So I think it's perhaps a nice one to end on. Does anybody want to come in on that?
I'll be the pessimist. I'm afraid that the death of patriarchy has been often announced, and patriarchy can even beat the virus. I mean, for example, in the United States, all the evidence shows that women have borne a disproportionate burden. Yet I don't see any signs of that leading to an empowerment of women. So I'm afraid that the real effect is very clearly negative, simply because of the nature of jobs. Certainly in the United States, the nature of jobs held by women, et cetera, the lower pay, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And I don't see it translating into an anger-driven politicization of saying, hey, we as women are getting screwed here. I have not seen any evidence of it, but maybe others have.
Yeah, I'm also very pessimistic. All the social studies that I read, sort of preliminary, shows that the COVID crisis, sets caregivers and, which are mostly women, really behind. I think the only silver lining I can think of is the Polish case, where the anti-abortion policies of the new government are extremely popular, and it led really to massive counter-mobilization that is against the policy, but also against backsliding. So, maybe that, you squeeze a lemon, maybe something good can come out of that. But in terms of, well-being and inequalities, this is just going to be tragic, I think.
I think it's going to vary according to socioeconomic status, because at the same time where I think women, let me go back. So one of the things I think we're going to see for women who are, say, in the informal economy is that they are not going to, in a sense, lose status because by virtue of being in the informal economy, some of them have been able to continue working. Granted, income levels, I'm sure, have dropped in some cases, but these are women who cannot afford not to be in the economy. And though I can imagine cases where for professional women, it will impact on their ability to go to work, particularly as offices shut down. Universities were closed, for example. But they were also the people most likely to have internet, to have their computers, and so were able to continue working. So I think it's really going to vary across occupation, but also across class.
Thank you. Are you okay, Dan, or do you want to?
Well, I guess one thing I would just say, to come back to the case I was talking about, the role of women in the leadership of the civil disobedience movement in Myanmar has been very, very pronounced and very much remarked upon. Now, I mean, historically, it's often through the leadership role that different groups play in struggles. Think about World War I and mass conscription and the way that parlayed into citizenship. So one could hope that in some way the kind of respect, like a real kind of universal respect toward the role that women are playing and the risks they're taking and the leadership they're playing will lead to some kind of citizenship gains. But obviously, it would be foolish to be overly optimistic about the capacity for that to happen, or just enormous barriers to that happening. But so certainly in terms of asserting not just equality, but in fact to be leading the movement, that's definitely happening in Myanmar today.
Great. Well, I think with that, we're running a little past over our time, and all things must pass and come to an end. So I'm going to make a few final closing remarks, but as I do, I want to just say thank you very much to all our panelists on the roundtable. It was a difficult brief to cover some part of the world in 15 minutes and say something about nationalism crisis, and I think we got a very interesting discussion coming out of that. So thank you very much. And now it falls to me to just address everybody with a few closing remarks for the whole conference. So it's time to bring this to a close. We've explored many variants of the crisis and the idea of crisis, including the impact of COVID, runs through many of the panels and examined on all sorts of dimensions: climate change, populism from the left and the right, crises of liberalism and democracy, the situation in Hong Kong, migration, diaspora, borders, citizenship, Brexit, the impact of the digital. And running through all of it, there are questions of nationalism and national belonging and identity, and how does that work. And of course, we haven't resolved much, but hopefully we've been provoking each other into thinking more carefully about what we mean by crisis and how it relates to nationalism. And I think if we've done that, we've done our job. I'd like to make a couple of brief announcements. It's traditional at the conference to announce the winners of Nations and Nationalism's Dominique Joaquin Berdal Prize. And so we have two winners for 2020, and they are Rolua Puya for their article Unsettled Autonomy, Ethnicity, Tribes, and Subnational Politics in Mizoram, Northeast India, which was published in the volume 27, number 2 of Nations and Nationalism, and Idrees Kandi for their article No Place for Kashmiri in Kashmiri Nationalism, published in volume 27, issue 1 of Nations and Nationalism. So congratulations to both of them, and encourage you to go read their articles. I'd like to also say the next ASEN event will be with the authors of the recent exchange in Nations and Nationalism on the quantitative measurement of ethnic and national identity. And the participants there will be Daniel Boschler, Elliot Green, Aaron Jen, Harris Milonas, and Andreas Wimmer. And that's at 15:30 UTC time on April 27th. and it'll be live streamed on Facebook and YouTube and Zoom for members. So you can get the details on that event on the 27th on our website at asen.ac.uk events. If I can, I'd like to make a pitch for ASEN membership to anybody out there who isn't a member or thinks they know somebody who might like to be one. With membership, you get online access to both Nations and Nationalism and studies in the ethnicity and nationalism. Optionally, you can get print copies of those journals. The archive of ASEN event recordings is available to members, invitations to Zoom calls for future events, and access to member directory. And there are more things that we plan to build into the offer to membership. Membership starts at £22 a year. And for full information, again, just go to our website /join. Regarding social media, don't forget to follow us on Facebook, and you can find us on Twitter at ASEN Events, at Sen Journal, and at N_nationalism for the two journals. I'd like to conclude by offering our collective thanks once more to all our plenary speakers throughout the last 3 days, to our coordinator, David Cole, who has been working behind the scenes, making everything run, and especially to our conference co-chairs, Isidore Dullard and Andi Hajiu, for organizing an excellent conference and helping it to run so smoothly. This year, we've been unable to socialize face-to-face, to go to the pub, to enjoy our traditional conference dinner together, but I think we've been able to enjoy each other's intellectual company, sharing ideas, and taking pleasure in that. Nonetheless, I propose to conclude the hopeful toast next year in person. So thanks, everybody, and everybody take care, and thanks for joining us.
Bye-bye.
Bye.